Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, independent Imperator, 46 to 45 BCE. The eldest son and namesake of the legendary Pompey the Great, Gnaeus took his father's banner and continued the civil war against Caesar. Hitherto he has attracted relatively little interest, perhaps because his heritage was the most significant fact about his life. However, while Gnaeus cannot be said to have earned anything, he was able to use his father's name to insinuate himself into high command. His career started promisingly enough, with him possibly becoming the first Roman to have a go with Cleopatra, before taking her troops to Greece. In 48, Gnaeus and his Egyptian squadron inflicted significant damage on Caesar's fleet, and he arguably did more than any of his father's other legates to advance the cause. In the wake of Pharsalus, however, Gnaeus's emotional immaturity and savage temper started to really come forward. In Africa, prior to Metellus Scipio's brilliant showing at Thapsus, Cato the Younger called upon Gnaeus to go be his father's son and save the Republic. Fired up by this unexpected endorsement, Gnaeus proceeded to attack Bogd of Mauritania, failed miserably, and ensured the African king's hostility going forward. Due to the criminal misgovernance by one of Caesar's legates in further Spain, the legions there mutinied and raised the banner of revolt, and then invited Gnaeus to become their leader. Bristling with energy and filled with fury, Gnaeus amassed a formidable force and compelled Caesar to campaign in person in Spain yet again. Despite having a larger army, Gnaeus was outclassed by the legendary conqueror of Gaul. Gnaeus began to lose his army's confidence due to his avoidance of direct open conflict. At the same time, his angry outburst and his use of confiscations and legal executions to raise money, and his draconian camp discipline were causing all but the most vehement enemies of Caesar to reconsider their commitment. Desperate, Gnaeus turned to fight, and this led to the long, brutal, and rather confusing mess at Munda, which was, coincidentally, Caesar's last and most hard-fought battle. Gnaeus' escape attempt was a failure, but it makes for damn fine yarn. The Pompeian cause died with Gnaeus despite Sextus Pompeius's prolonged period of independent resistance to the Second Triumvirate. The Pompei were a relatively new family in Roman politics. In fact, the first member of their family to go to Rome and join the Senate was Gnaeus' grandfather, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo. The family hailed from Picenum in northeast Italy, and especially in the lifetime of both Pompeius Strabo and Pompey the Great, they often could go there to rally support. So this was still an area where the Pompeius name carried a lot of weight. The first member to go into the Senate, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, became a star during the Social War. He was consul the year that the war pretty much reached its end. Of course, it wouldn't formally end until the next year, but 89 was when the war was starting to wind down a bit, and when Rome was starting to move toward a negotiated settlement. But what Pompeius Strabo showed is that he was one of the very few generals in Rome who was capable of winning battles in that particular conflict. The only other two generals who had success were Marius and Sulla. And so Pompeius Strabo became kind of the third man in Roman politics at that time. That being said, he would die early due to a lightning strike or some other freak accident, and this would leave Rome with only two political titans, an aging Marius and the sociopath Sulla. If we fast forward a bit to when Sulla returns from the east, this meant that Strabo's son, Gnaeus Pompeius, was able to then become commander of his father's former men, raise an army to help Sulla, and from there become a major fixture of the Sullan establishment. But far from being a man who peaked early, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great as we call him in English, went on to become one of the true greats in Roman political history. He added about half of the Republic's land or so, and brought in an immense amount of wealth. So by the time that Gnaeus was born, his father was already on the path to becoming the Great. And certainly by the time that Gnaeus was old enough to really think about his place in the world, he realized that he had very big sandals to fill, and that he would forever reside in his father's shadow, barring some sort of a miracle where he's able to somehow get on par with him. So in a way, Gnaeus was probably under a lot of pressure from an early age to really live up to the name that he had inherited. At the same time, of course, that came with innumerable advantages. Just because of his name, many doors would be open. We can kind of date Gnaeus' birth a little bit based on the fact that when the war broke out in 49, he had not held any offices yet. And this means, of course, that he was not quite old enough. So he had not yet attained his 28th or 29th birthday, and so he must have been born 76 BCE or a bit later. But certainly he does appear to have been pretty close to office holding age, and he was not super young. So he was old enough to at least have a little bit of authority once the war starts. We also know that in 56, probably in the spring, he married the daughter of Appius Claudius Pulcher, who became consul a couple years later and was also the elder brother of the notorious Clodius. So Gnaeus Pompeius was figured into some of the most elite circles in the Roman world, and because of his father's attainments, even the snobby gens Claudia was willing to have a marriage alliance with him. He also has a famous younger brother who would go on to achieve a lot of eminence after Gnaeus' death, and that is Sextus. Sextus has an interesting career in his own right as a kind of pirate king, but that's a different story for a different time. In Gnaeus' lifetime, Sextus is a pretty minor player, although the two brothers will fight side by side, especially in the Spanish War. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49, Pompey fell back and ultimately retreated to Greece, where he was accompanied by a pretty large number of senators, including a lot of the heavier hitters in Roman politics. This was a very top-heavy command tent that Pompey presided over in Greece, and so you might not think that his son Gnaeus would have a whole lot of pull there, and yet Gnaeus, in fact, would be a pretty major player in his father's military operations. The first task that Gnaeus was given was to go to Egypt and call upon the Egyptians, to whom Pompey had some previous ties, in order to receive assistance. At this time, the government was under the command of a 19-year-old Cleopatra VII. Technically, her brother Ptolemy XIII was in charge, and he had a number of advisors, but Cleopatra was the most dominant individual in the government at the time. And we also hear an anecdote from Plutarch that perhaps Gnaeus might have been the first Roman to bed Cleopatra. Of course, he would not be the last. But this is a later testimony, so most likely Caesar was the first one who had that honor, but there is at least a chance that it was indeed Gnaeus Pompeius the Younger. The reason why Gnaeus had gone to Egypt in the first place is that back around 55 or so, Gabinius had gone to Egypt on Pompey's behest, and he had left a number of men who stayed behind as kind of like advisors or even mercenaries, and they were called Gabinius's men, for lack of a better term. And so these men accompanied Gnaeus back to his father's main army, and with them they brought a number of Egyptian warships, about 40 to 50 of them, and so these would become a major part of Pompey's overall navy. And for whatever reason, as we'll see, Gnaeus himself would get sole command of all these forces. In the meantime, back in Egypt, it would appear that the removal of Gabinius's men and this large number of ships helped to destabilize the government and caused Ptolemy's officials to make a move on Cleopatra. So Cleopatra will actually be out of power and in a desperate situation when Caesar arrives in late 48, pursuing none other than Pompey. So all of that is connected, and a lot of that might just be due to the simple removal of men who might have been more loyal to Cleopatra than to Ptolemy. So Gabinius's men may have been there indeed as a way to shore up Cleopatra's authority. At any rate, though, these men would now be fighting in western Greece in the Adriatic Sea. One of the reasons that the Senate had clashed with Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus in the past is simply that they didn't like some of their members having so much more influence than others. And so it should come as no surprise that the men who went with Pompey were all jealous of their prerogatives. And since the command tent tended to be very heavily loaded with senior magistrates, men who had been consul or praetor, and who thought that they all deserved a command, it was inevitable that many of them would walk away with hurt feelings when the assignments were doled out. And of the people who were rewarded, one of them was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, who had been consul back in 59 with Caesar. He was given overall fleet command, and for the most part he would do pretty well with it, even if he tended to be a bit heavy-handed and brutal. When it came to the men under him, however, almost all of them were forced to share command of small squadrons. Sometimes a squadron would only have about 10 or 15 ships, and you'd have two ex-praetors or ex-consuls in co-command of it. So there was a great deal of compression in the Pompeian army. However, one lucky young man who happened to be Pompey's son, was able to command an entire large squadron. So Gnaeus, as we mentioned, went to Egypt. He got the 40 or 50 ships from the Ptolemies, and he will now serve as the sole commander of that formation. It's also possible, of course, that he did have an Egyptian advisor who helped him to actually run things. In fact, I would say that's almost certainly the case. Nonetheless, in Roman terms, he was the sole commander. This also means that he has the most powerful squadron in the fleet, and he is the only one who really is going to get a chance to do much in terms of distinguishing himself, unless we talk about the deeds of Scribonius Libo and Marcus Octavius. And in the case of Octavius, we've already talked about him. Scribonius Libo we'll talk about later. In terms of why Gnaeus was able to get this command when so many men who were vastly senior to him didn't get anything or had to share, there's a pretty good chance that the Egyptian government requested that Gnaeus be the one to lead their men in the battle, since they had his word that he would keep them safe and sound. Or, of course, there's also the later rumor that Gnaeus had slept with Cleopatra, and perhaps that had been something that she had worked into the contract at his request. We don't really know. At any rate, though, Gnaeus would prove that despite not really deserving this command, he still would make a good show of it. One often neglected aspect of Caesar's civil war is how much difficulty Caesar had in getting all of his men across from Italy to Greece in 48. And a lot of that is due to the good performance of Bibulus and his fleet. Bibulus and his other commanders had inflicted some relatively heavy losses on Caesar's fleet, and that had actually slowed them down and forced them to make more trips since they had taken casualties in both their warships and transports. Now, eventually Caesar will get all his men across, but we have to keep in mind that interceptions were actually incredibly difficult in the ancient world, and in fact, you probably had well above a 50% chance, if you were the invading force, of completely evading the defensive fleet and getting your landing in before they found you. So trying to intercept an invasion fleet is actually rather dicey and not all that likely. The bigger threat would be that you start landing and then the enemy fleet finds you and attacks you while you're trying to disembark, rather than that you actually get intercepted and forced to fight a big naval battle. Anyhow, Caesar will eventually get all of his men landed. Bibulus will die not too long after that, and Caesar will leave his boats parked with the possibility of retrieving them if he needed to flee. One of the places he chose to use as a naval base was Oricum, and what he did here is left a fairly substantial number of warships in the harbor, the inner harbor that is, and he left 3 whole cohorts to guard the town. And for reference, 10 cohorts is a full legion, so this is nearly half a legion to guard a number of warships. There was also a minor legate left in charge as well, and he set up a special defense for the harbor by sinking 1 merchantman at the entrance to make it difficult, if not impossible, to just straight sail in. And then he had another merchantman right behind that ship, and he erected a siege tower on it, where the defenders could fire down on anybody coming in the harbor. So you have a physical boundary, and then you have a missile platform. We don't know exactly who ordered Gnaeus to go to Oricum, but it's possible that he acted on his own initiative. His dad was busy by this time conducting land operations, and Gnaeus seems to have been rather headstrong at any rate. So he led his Egyptian squadron, and he was determined to take the town of Oricum and take Caesar's warships in the harbor. So far as we know, Oricum was Gnaeus Pompeius's first battle. However, he would show that he had much of his father's methodical approach to warfare and some of his father's strategic sense. He had a two-pronged approach to taking Oricum. On the one hand, some of his men disembarked and attacked by land to tie up the cohorts in the city, but the main effort was against the harbor itself. And so the first step was for his vessels to use their winches and ropes to drag the sunken ship out of the way, presumably out into deeper water, where it could then settle at the bottom and not obstruct the opening. And then from there, they sailed in and started to assault the tower ship. Now, the tower ship was very strong, and no one ship was going to be able to break through it, so what he did is rotate his attacking vessels to wear down the defenders physically, and they also weren't going to be getting refreshments from the city because, again, his men on land were attacking there. And so, as the defenders wore down, they eventually broke and fled, and that enabled Gnaeus to enter the harbor. However, he still had not removed the tower ship, and so the way that he was able to get into the harbor was that he put 4 of his light biremes on rollers, and then had them move overland over a little bit of terrain on the mole. So we've already seen that the harbor had a very narrow mole going across it. And then he got them back in the water in the inner harbor. They were then able to ride up and drag away 4 other ships, while then setting fire to the rest. Which also means, of course, that the garrison was not able to sally out and try to save their ships, because again, they were tied up by that land assault. However, the land assault actually did not carry the city. And so, in order to prevent Oricum from being used for more supply runs by Caesar, one of the other naval commanders, Decimus Laelius, who commanded the Asian squadron, was now posted in Oricum near the harbor to prevent any more supplies from coming in. And since hopefully this would remain a secret to anybody sailing to Greece, the hope was that they would be able to catch some of these supply ships and use them for themselves. This was also at a time, by the way, when the Pompeians started to massacre crews of captured Caesarian ships. Once Laelius relieved him, Gnaeus was now free to go look for other targets of opportunity. And it turns out that Caesar had dispersed his fleet in a number of different ports, one of which was Lissus in what is now Albania. Here, Mark Antony had left 30 of his cargo ships when he had led the second wave of Caesarian soldiers into Greece. It appears that Gnaeus was able to take these ships without really having to do all that much work. They apparently were not expecting him, so he was able to take the city by surprise, capture those ships and burn them pretty quickly, and then he decided to go assault the city itself. However, according to Caesar, there were not only friendly Roman citizens here, but apparently a handful of his own soldiers, and they banded together and were able to repulse the attack. Caesar also went into a little bit of detail about how there was kind of a local defense league that was in play among the citizens of this area. At any rate, this league seems to have been aligned with Caesar, and they showed their loyalty here. Caesar then painted that little bit of local support and the holding of Lissus, and said that this as a whole was a victory for him and a defeat for Pompey. That being said, I think it's pretty clear that the young legate Pompeius actually did a pretty good service to his father, because by taking out the warships at Oricum and the naval cargo ships at Lissus, what he had done was to greatly reduce Caesar's ability to move and also supply himself by sea. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey often relied upon ships to get supplies, and Caesar now no longer had the naval capacity to go out and challenge that. So that was a big factor there. And after Dyrrhachium failed for Caesar, he also couldn't consider something like getting on ships and moving into the Peloponnese, or going back to Italy, or trying to sail around Pompey and gain his northern flank, or anything like that. So that's why he had to march inland. And by all rights, Pompey had won the war after he won the Battle of Dyrrhachium. And a lot of that is set up by the fact that his son, Gnaeus Pompeius, had won these 2 naval victories and forced Caesar to go inland. So again, if Pompey had either fought and won at Pharsalus or simply not fought the battle and let Caesar starve, then the way that these 2 minor battles would be remembered would be much different, because they'd be seen as preliminaries that help set up Pompey's final and greatest tactical masterpiece. Of course, as we know, Pompey did opt to fight at Pharsalus, and he failed to opt in to win the battle. And so at Pharsalus, his army was routed, a number of senior commanders were killed, and quite a number of others were now scattered to the 7 winds. Some had been apprehended by Caesar and given a pardon, and so it was not entirely clear who was still available and who was still willing to keep fighting on. A number of the senior Pompeians had fled the battle and had arrived at the island of Corcyra, which once again they were able to reach because of the earlier work by Gnaeus and other Pompeian admirals who had won naval superiority in the Adriatic. Now, news would arrive while they were assembled here that Pompey had been murdered in Egypt by the Ptolemaic government. And so this sent a shockwave through these assembled senators, but no one probably felt it as more of a gut punch than Gnaeus Pompeius, who was definitely here, and it's also possible that his younger brother Sextus was here at the same time as well. And so, as you might imagine, Gnaeus was not terribly pleased with that news and was distraught. But there was another issue at hand that they had to deal with, beyond mourning for their lost leader, because they needed a new supreme commander. After all, they were saying that they were fighting Caesar as the legal Senate, and they needed someone to head their cause, someone to be the commander-in-chief of the armies they had amassed. And if they were following strict right of seniority, and given that this was a cause that was really spearheaded by that hard core of the Optimates, the ultra-conservatives, they were very much bent upon following the very strict interpretation of seniority. And so the senior man present here, who may very well have been the senior man period at this point, was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the famous orator. Cicero, however, was no military man, and he never deluded himself into thinking that he was. He knew that his strengths were things like politics, philosophy, and the law. And so he had no interest in trying to play general at this late date, and so he declined the honor. And he also said that he frankly wasn't going to accept it because he knew that the war was now unwinnable. Without Pompey, the cause had no one to rally around, and so he was going to call it quits, and if they were wise, they would also throw in the towel. However, this did not settle well with young Gnaeus. So Gnaeus, perhaps feeling that his father had been slighted, threatened to murder Cicero on the spot. And being much younger than Cicero and probably a lot tougher since Cicero was never much of an athlete, Gnaeus almost certainly could have done just that. But one guy who was never averse to being in a fist fight was Cato the Younger, and he apparently had a lot of sway with Gnaeus, and he was able to restrain him, whether by words or by force is unclear. But at any rate, Cicero would go back to Italy, and of course, because it happened to Cicero, we know about it. There will be other instances in the future, by the way, where Gnaeus will show that he is very quick to temper, and that he often would engage in violence or threats of violence when his feelings got hurt, which was quite often. Most of the other Pompeian consulars came to the same decision that Cicero did, namely that the cause was lost and that they were better off going home. And as for the others who might have emerged as commanders-in-chief, most of them were dead. Only one consular ended up showing up in Africa and claiming the mantle of command, and that was Metellus Scipio. This in itself was a controversial claim, as Aetius Varus, the Praetorian governor there, had organized a large army and had done all of the legwork, and he felt that Metellus Scipio was stealing his thunder. However, Cato the Younger arrived and settled the issue in favor of Metellus Scipio because he believed in hierarchy, and Metellus Scipio did technically outrank all of them. Therefore, he should be commander despite whatever he may or may not have done. And so Cato was the one who resolved that dispute, which also means that he must have traveled, or at least probably traveled, with the Pompey brothers Gnaeus and Sextus. So they would have been present when Metellus Scipio was given his great command that he did so well at Thapsus. However, Metellus Scipio would disperse his other senior commanders to get them out of his hair. So, for instance, Aetius Varus and Marcus Octavius, both of whom were Praetorians, were sent to command a fleet together. And Cato was sent to command at the city of Utica, which was away from the battlefront. Cato accepted this because, again, hierarchy trumped common sense or strategic sense or winning the war, and so he now had very little to do at Utica, and with him were the Pompey brothers. Cato, while he could accept his own fate, did not think it fair that these young men be consigned to garrison duty, and so he actually harangued Gnaeus, telling him all about his father's great deeds against Sulla, and saying that he too should go forth and be a great Pompey. And so Gnaeus was inspired by this, and he would take a couple thousand men and a small force of ships and go set forth to try to reclaim some of the glory of the Pompey name. In terms of why Cato dispatched Gnaeus with this force, we don't really know. It could be that Cato wanted to get rid of someone who was a hot-headed fool, that's what one scholar has said, and people who are very pro-Cato think that he had the foresight to realize that Gnaeus could revive the war effort if he was alive and unharmed. and perhaps he realized, as everybody else did, that Metellus Scipio was flamingly incompetent and would almost certainly find a way to lose to Caesar in Africa. But the truth is probably more prosaic. Cato simply wanted to send Gnaeus out and hope that he could maybe replicate the success he had back in Greece, where he had a fairly small fleet and a landing party. And with the name Pompey, that could have some sway, and maybe he could win over some allies who could then help the war cause back in Africa. We'll never know exactly what Cato was thinking. But at any rate, this would be immensely important for Gnaeus's career. And he also, of course, therefore would not be present either for the Battle of Thapsus, the news when it arrived, or Cato's suicide. Setting out from Roman Africa, which is approximately modern Tunisia, Gnaeus made his way west to Mauritania, which is approximately modern Algeria and Morocco. And here, the Mauritanian kingdom was led by a man named Bogid. For the most part, Bogid had not played a major role in the Roman Civil War. The one time he had intervened was as an ally of the Caesarian governor Quintus Cassius Longinus, but that had been a pretty minor incident. And while he must have had a little bit of sympathy for Caesar, he does not seem to have been completely and totally committed. We have to remember, too, that Caesar's Spanish campaign, the first one, was a lightning campaign, and so this would have inspired a lot of fear and respect in Bogid, who also may have been hearing some things on the DL out of Gaul for a decade plus. So perhaps he had simply been awed by Caesar, and he might have been willing to work with the Pompeians if circumstances were favorable. At any rate, though, Gnaeus decided to punish Bogid, perhaps because of his intervention on behalf of Quintus Cassius, and he gathered 2,000 men. According to the Caesarian source, most of them, of course, were slaves. That's just kind of a stock accusation that hostile political factions make against one another, that all their supporters are slaves and freedmen and gladiators and blah, blah, blah. And also 30 ships. And with this small force, he made his way to Mauritania. It's not clear exactly what Gnaeus was hoping to accomplish. Most likely he was looking to take a few cities in retribution and build up his name. Perhaps also intimidate Bogid into reconsidering his allegiance. Gnaeus landed near a town called Ascarum. We're not really sure what town that might be. And he seems to have been under the impression that he had achieved surprise. And this is because the locals were not responding. In fact, the city was quiet, and so his men were able to march right up to the city. And it was only when they were about to assault the gates and they were under the walls that the enemy appeared. And they appeared and suddenly struck. And so this was quite unexpected. It was also demoralizing. Gnaeus took some losses, and then he beat a quick retreat back to the coast, boarded his ships, and decided to never mess with Mauritania again. In fact, he'd retreat all the way to the Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain. Gnaeus remained in the Balearic Islands, perhaps looking for slingers. The islands were famous for producing some of the top slingers in the ancient world, and most likely he didn't really have a plan. However, something was going to literally fall from the heavens into his lap, because at this time he received word that the situation in farther Spain had really taken a turn that favored him. So early in the Civil War, Caesar had conquered Spain, and he had left behind as governor in farther Spain Quintus Cassius Longinus. And Cassius had been notoriously cruel and corrupt, and this had meant that he had alienated both the local elites, who had been friendly to Caesar, at least passively friendly, and the legions, who thought that Caesar would reward them generously. Now, some of these men had served under Caesar originally, but a lot of them were men who had been recruited by Pompey and then had been retained. Now, a number of the men who had been originally mobilized by Pompey had been disbanded, but some of them were still under arms and with Quintus Cassius. And because of his various failings, that he had alienated all of these guys. And this also means that these men might have been in contact with the disbanded soldiers, who were perhaps eager to reclaim their status as legionaries and fight for pay. Caesar understood that this was a major crisis, and he actually sent two of his best men, Gaius Trebonius and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the future triumvir, But the two of them were not able to effectively negotiate with these men who were in mutiny, and eventually, perhaps fearing punishment if they went back to Caesar, especially punishment for the ringleaders, they decided to declare their allegiance to none other than the younger Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. And so Gnaeus would land in Spain and make his way to these men and become their new leader. Thus why I called him an independent imperator, because I can't think of anything else that would describe his position better. Once he linked up with his men in farther Spain, Gnaeus Pompeius would show that he was indeed his father's son, and had his father's energy. And so, using a combination of force, the general discontent with Caesarian rule, at least among the elite, and the power of his father's name, which still resonated in Spain due to the Sertorian revolt, where Pompey was key to putting that down, Gnaeus was able to use all of these connections together to raise an army of 13 legions, which is one of the greatest armies of this era, and one of the greatest in the Civil War period. That being said, this was not necessarily a super high quality army that Gnaeus was yielding. There were only really two noteworthy units, and both of these had been under Trebonius before they declared for Gnaeus. The most important of them was the Vernacular Legion, which features very prominently in the Caesarian Spanish War account. The other unit was the Second Legion, which doesn't really have as much to do. Probably the biggest asset that Gnaeus had on his side was Titus Labienus as his legate. Labienus was, of course, Caesar's greatest general in Gaul, and he had served in every major theater of operations during the Civil War, albeit never as a commander-in-chief because he was a mere praetor. But in the operations he had commanded, such as the skirmishes in Africa prior to Metellus Scipio taking a firm hand, he had shown competence and he had succeeded. Everything that he had done had pretty much worked, except, of course, for his role at Pharsalus, where he was the guy who was the victim of Caesar's great surprise. But for the most part, Labienus was the one commander who had something of a chance against Caesar. And exactly how closely Gnaeus heeded Labienus's advice we'll never know, but I think there's a reasonable expectation that Gnaeus did listen to Labienus, at least some. Caesar, on the other hand, had only a few legates with him, and most of them were not all that noteworthy. Quintus Pedius was his nephew. There was Fabius Maximus, who was okay, but he didn't have anybody special, certainly no one on Labienus's level. Caesar also had an inferior army. So normally Caesar's army was more experienced, even if it was smaller. In this case, it was not necessarily that much more experienced, and it was a lot smaller. He only had 2 veteran legions with him. He had the 5th Aladi, and he had the legendary 10th Legion, although by this time the 10th Legion was perhaps half strength. And so it was not necessarily the 10th Legion as it had existed in prior campaigns, but as we'll see, it still performed just as well, even if it was now pretty badly undermanned. In terms of Caesar's support in Spain, it was a lot spottier than what Gnaeus could enjoy. Caesar had some strong support in the coastal south because he had granted citizenship to the citizens of Gades. He also had helped to sponsor men like Balbus, who we met earlier. But for the most part, he really was not that popular among most of the leaders of Spain, despite his long-standing command in the west. And a lot of that is because he had relieved a lot of debt. And so many of the elite who were moneylenders were upset with Caesar, and they were very much determined to see Gnaeus' cause through to the bitter end. So Gnaeus actually put himself in a good position to win this campaign. And Caesar, by his own admission, said later that this was the hardest fight of his entire career. And yes, that would include his war against Vercingetorix that culminated at Alesia. Being outnumbered like he was, for Caesar, it was important to have a good plan and to stick to it. Caesar's strategy effectively was to prevent the fall of any more allied cities into Pompey's hands, and then to go and try to demoralize the numerically superior Pompeian army, perhaps through skirmishing. And once he had established the superiority of his army, despite the fact that this army really wasn't of the same caliber as some of the earlier armies he had led, he wanted to seek out Gnaeus in a field battle and decide things there. He knew that logistically he was at a disadvantage, and so he didn't want this to be a long campaign, but at the same time, this couldn't be a one-and-done campaign. He couldn't just go in and fight a single battle, because he needed to make sure that the conditions were right, and that Gnaeus had a little bit of fear in his heart of what Caesar could do. And so, one of the things that Caesar was probably banking on is that Roman soldiers tended to very much look down upon their commanders if they retreated. They tended to take retreat as a sign both of personal weakness in a moral sense, and also that the general has a lack of confidence in his own men. They tend to take it as an insult. And so this is something that ancient generals had to deal with, especially in this period. And this would actually become worse in the imperial period, by the way. So Caesar knew that if he could make Gnaeus retreat before him, whether in a standoff or whether because he needs to go save something that Caesar's threatening, that this might undermine confidence in Gnaeus' leadership. After all, Gnaeus was still largely unproven, especially compared to Caesar, who by this time had been one of, if not the greatest generals on the planet for the last 15 years or so. And so, Gnaeus would perhaps not really understand Caesar's plan well enough, because mostly what he would do is he would shadow Caesar's movements, and he also tried to avoid field battles. So perhaps he thought that the advantage in an open battle would lay with Caesar. Maybe he was thinking along Fabian lines, and he was thinking of Caesar as a kind of Hannibal. At any rate, a lot of the action in many of the early battles would be conducted very similarly to how the Battle of Dyrrhachium was fought, where men would only engage in trenches and in fairly limited skirmishes. It's also worth noting that by this point in the Civil War, the mood was one of brutality. Caesar had already pardoned most of his major opponents, and so most of the surviving men were regarded as simple rebels and renegades. And as for Gnaeus, he also was engaging in some very inflammatory rhetoric, and he was effectively calling Caesar a traitor and all of his men treacherous and all that. And so, quarter was more the exception than the rule throughout this campaign. And there are a number of atrocities reported in the Spanish War, but I'm not going to be going into most of them because it would get a bit repetitive and it would largely distract from Gnaeus' generalship against Caesar. When he arrived with his army in Spain, Caesar's first goal was to try to threaten the capital city of Cordoba. This was actually governed by Gnaeus' brother Sextus. However, he was being inundated with requests from the allied city of Ulia, which had been under siege from Gnaeus in person. This meant that Gnaeus' main force was out of position in regard to guarding the capital. So what Caesar decided to do was to send a small detachment to relieve the people of Ulia, or at least to give them hope, while sending his main force at the capital, and that way Gnaeus would feel off balance. He would either have to risk potentially losing his capital and all of his logistics, or he'd have to risk abandoning an operation into which he had already poured a significant amount of effort. Ulia had been holding out for months by this point. And so Caesar chose a legate who had a lot of local experience, presumably meaning that he grew up in Spain, Lucius Vibius Paciacus. And he gave him a small force with which to harass Gnaeus and try to keep the people of Ulia going. Caesar does not seem to have expected that Paciacus could actually relieve the siege, but in fact that was exactly what happened, because Paciacus was able to create enough of a distraction that the citizens there were able to actually sally out and escape, and therefore join the Caesarian army. Gnaeus, in the meantime, not only had to deal with this setback and embarrassment, but also he began to fear for Sextus' safety, and so he retreated to save his brother and his capital city. This was an important opening for Caesar because it accomplished his goal of forcing Gnaeus to retreat, and also of seizing the initiative, and showing that he would protect his allies. So Caesar established his own dominance and strength while making Gnaeus look weak. And Gnaeus apparently was somewhat intimidated by this because later on they will be fighting over attempts to get over the Baetis River. And Caesar will in the crossing have more of a skirmish with Gnaeus than an actual battle. So Gnaeus will actually take up a position on the other side, but not seek a general engagement. So he won't let Caesar just cross and then fight him at that point, where Caesar would be at a disadvantage because he's trying to defend a bridgehead. So this shows that Caesar's objective of establishing a kind of feeling of dominance had succeeded, and now Gnaeus is firmly on the back foot despite having a significant numerical advantage. I would just like to mention in brief that our account of the Spanish War is not very well written. It's written by an unknown person who was in Caesar's army, and so sometimes it might be a little bit difficult to get the details of this right. That being said, let's do the best we can. So Caesar had not been able to get across the river Baetis. Either that or he hadn't been able to gain enough of an advantage to risk a general engagement, which is now what he wanted. He felt like he had enough of an advantage to risk something like that. And so he wanted to force Pompey to fight by attacking something that was near and dear to the heart of Pompey's cause. And Caesar thought that was none other than the city of Antegua, which was probably about the second strongest place he held after Cordoba. And Cordoba was in all likelihood too strong to assault. So Caesar knew that he needed to go after something that was attainable, but also valuable. During this siege operation, Gnaeus decided not to risk a siege battle for the city. And he actually did have a couple of decent moments during the operation. For instance, at one point, he managed to use the fog to attack and wipe out several hundred of Caesar's men, mostly cavalry and light infantry. And in fact, apparently this created a shortage in Caesar's army for a bit, because later the account talks about how there were some much needed reinforcements of exactly those kind of troops, cavalry and light infantry. And so, Gnaeus did a couple of things right during this operation, but ultimately he was not aggressive enough because he was eager to deny Caesar the opportunity of a field battle. At one point, the garrison at Antegua decided to mount a major sortie, and apparently they were in contact with Gnaeus, and while they mounted a very strong sortie that almost succeeded, it failed ultimately because Gnaeus didn't provide any help whatsoever, thinking that they could do it on their own. Because again, if he were to provide assistance, that would increase the possibility of him getting sucked into a general engagement. After this sortie failed and the garrison was trapped, they now slaughtered the civilians in order to save on food and strengthen the resolve. There were more relief attempts after this massacre, and in one of those relief attempts that Gnaeus was now mounting, so he assaulted Caesar's entrenchments. During one of these engagements, there was a fierce fight with low casualties, but of the casualties, 2 of them were centurions on Caesar's side. And the next day, Gnaeus decided to renew the attack. And this time, things went vastly differently, as Caesar's men were enraged by the loss of their centurions, and they ended up killing hundreds of Gnaeus's men. Later on, before the city fell, 2 men emerged from the ranks and actually fought a Homeric-style duel. And then that led to a more general conflict, and there was another small battle on one part of the line. In the end, though, the garrison was not able to hold out, and Caesar was able to take Antegua. Thus, he had prevailed here, and Gnaeus was now looking a bit weak in the eyes of his men, as he had failed to save the city, and he had shown indecision in one of the more important moments of the battle, where the garrison had almost escaped, but didn't because he had failed to act in time. Ulia had been a minor embarrassment, but Antegua was something that started to really make people question whether Gnaeus had it in him to actually stand up to Caesar. And so militarily, Gnaeus was experiencing some problems, but there were other compounding factors. And the real problem that Gnaeus had when it came to dealing with his men, his officers, and his civilian supporters is that he had a terrible personality. He had a very sharp temper. He was also completely humorless, and he was starting to really lose support. In fact, it had become something of a universally accepted fact back in Rome that Gnaeus Pompeius was a complete and total asshole. In January of 45, Cassius, the future assassin, wrote to Cicero And remember, both of these guys are far more sympathetic to the Pompeian than to the Caesarian cause. And he talked about how thin-skinned Gnaeus was, how Gnaeus would be likely to avenge an insult with a stab wound, that Gnaeus is not the kind of guy who can deal with a witticism. And even more to the point, if he hears a remark that he can in any way construe as an insult, even if it's not intended to be that, that's how he's going to take it. And he said that if Gnaeus somehow prevails in Spain, that things might actually be worse than if Caesar wins. And remember, this is Cassius writing this, the guy who will later murder Caesar because he thinks that Caesar is killing the Republic. And even he is thinking that perhaps Gnaeus might actually be the greater of the two evils. So it's kind of an incredible state of affairs when some of these guys who had left the cause are now looking at Caesar's operations in Spain and thinking, you know what, maybe Caesar is not the worst thing in the world. We also hear from the author of the Spanish War that Gnaeus was fond of confiscating goods even from his own wealthy supporters by building trumped-up charges. Now, of course, we have to remember that the person who wrote the Spanish War is a partisan hack for Caesar, and so often repeats many of the tropes that one would repeat against a political opponent, such as all their supporters are gladiators or freed slaves or debtors, and also that they engage in cruelty and etc., etc. But that being said, if even some people who would be predisposed to be allies of Gnaeus speak so lowly of him, there's at least a good chance that some of this is true. We also know that as desertions began to increase during and after the Ategua operation, that Gnaeus decided to crack down on discipline in order to try to keep his men together. If he couldn't rule through love and through success, he would rule through fear instead. And so he began to execute deserters in order to try to keep his army coherent. But Gnaeus knew that this could not go on forever, and that despite his best efforts, he was still hemorrhaging support. So he decided that he needed to fight one final decisive battle in order to try to turn things around. This was his last and perhaps only hope at this point. Every day, Gnaeus's men lost a little bit more confidence in his leadership, and every night more of them abandoned the camp. Gnaeus knew that this meant that he had no choice but to try to fight a decisive battle sooner rather than later. The longer he waited, the worse things would get. And so he chose a site near the town of Munda. He found a piece of high ground that gave him a major advantage. He still had the numerical edge. He still had 11 of his 13 legions with him. 2 of them he had had to dispatch elsewhere. But this still gave him a pretty good numerical edge over Caesar, who really only had 7.5 legions. Now, for his part, when Caesar saw Gnaeus form up, he was pretty pleased. He thought that this was a great opportunity, and that he would finally get the decisive battle that he wanted. He also assumed that Gnaeus would come down to the plain to fight him in the open. After all, Gnaeus had been the one who kind of issued the challenge by drawing up his men, and it was customary for men to meet on open, flat terrain when possible. And given that Gnaeus had the edge in both infantry and cavalry, it would make sense to try to fight in the open to use a flanking maneuver, and to use that, especially cavalry, to maximum effect. But that's not what Gnaeus did. What Gnaeus did instead was to hold his position uphill and ask Caesar to come meet him. And so that's exactly what ended up happening. Caesar was impatient to get this over with, but at the same time he didn't want to fight at a disadvantage. And there's some evidence to suggest that actually Caesar's men kind of forced the battle on him. That when Caesar was holding back and waiting for Gnaeus to come join him, that his men thought Caesar was being too cautious. And so they demanded that Caesar go fight. They wanted to win this war and go home. And they also thought that Gnaeus stood no chance against them. So Caesar perhaps was kind of strong-armed by his own soldiers into fighting this battle. And remember what I said earlier about how a lot of these armies have men who will push their generals to do things. And they also will take it as an insult to their valor if their generals are cautious. And so perhaps fearing that his men might lose faith in him, Caesar decided that it was time to fight the decisive battle. So Gnaeus had chosen a pretty good piece of ground, and he was now going to get Caesar coming at him uphill, which would give him a bit of an advantage, because you always have an advantage if you're fighting from uphill in edged weapon combat. So Gnaeus had done fairly well for himself in setting this battle up the way that he had. Sure, he'd made mistakes before this, but his choice of his position at Munda was actually quite sound. When it comes to the Battle of Munda, it's almost impossible to really recreate exactly what happened here. The battle was fairly chaotic by its very nature, and our main and best source for it is the aforementioned anonymous Spanish War, which is a part of Caesar's commentaries. And because this account is so poorly written, it's very hard to really come away with the impression that we really understand what happened. There are also some contradictory pieces of information depending on which source you follow. So if you follow the Spanish War, you get kind of this impression of a very hard-fought, bitterly contested battle. And if you were to, say, read Plutarch's account, you get the impression that Caesar's men were the ones who were afraid to engage, and that he shamed them into fighting uphill by simply taking his shield and saying he'd do it himself, and that they were leaving an old man to die, and then they followed him. Either way, though, it's possible that some of these details just got confused or muddled because the battle lasted for 8 hours, so perhaps his men were wavering and then Caesar exposed himself. It's hard to say. At any rate, though, it does appear that the decisive moment at Munda was when the 10th Legion on the right wing was able to break through, and that before Gnaeus and Labienus were able to send in a legion to plug the hole, Bogid, who had arrived as a Caesarian ally, remember that, how Gnaeus had provoked Bogid, and now Bogid would have even more revenge, so Bogid would send his Mauritanian cavalry through the gap, and then that would create a general rout, as now Pompey's lines had been penetrated and compromised, and at this point the Pompeian army would break, and as is almost always the case in any ancient battle, the vast, overwhelming majority of the casualties happen once an army breaks, because most fatal wounds occurred in the back. And so that led to a lopsided result despite a prolonged struggle, where Caesar only lost 1,000 men, but the Pompeian force of perhaps 70,000 suffered 30,000 losses right there on the field. And of course there would be further reprisals as Caesar would capture some of the men who would take refuge at Munda, and so the bloodshed did not end at this battle. Later, of course, Caesar would say this was his hardest fought battle, that he had often striven for victory, but never before had he had to really fight for his own life the way that he had in this battle. Much as had happened with the senior commanders at Pharsalus, Gnaeus and his brother Sextus fled in different directions and had very different fates. Gnaeus was able to escape with a handful of horsemen to the friendly city of Cartia, which had been a firm backer of his war effort, or at least the city fathers had, and so he threw himself upon the local elite for protection. And up to this point they had been very friendly and supportive. However, given that his cause was now completely and totally shattered, and given how brutal the war had been in terms of reprisals, we now had a situation where they went from a solid block of all pro-Pompey people to some of them now embracing Caesar and saying that they should hand over Gnaeus immediately in order to curry favor with the new government. And so this new factionalism would quickly lead to actual fighting, and so this would lead to fighting in the streets of Cartia between the local elites. During this fighting, Gnaeus seems to have been wounded, if he wasn't wounded already after the Battle of Munda, and we know that by the time he leaves Cartia, he'll have both a shoulder and a leg wound, both of which apparently are fairly severe. So by the time that he leaves, he's no longer in any kind of condition to fight. And when he does escape from Cartia, he'll be escaping with 20 ships that he appropriates. Whether they were offered to him or whether he just took them is hard to say. But this will hardly be the kind of reception that he wanted, and the flight will be one for his life. So again, he's still a refugee, and actually his situation has gotten worse since the Battle of Munda rather than better. We don't know exactly where Gnaeus was planning on holing up with his fleet. Perhaps he was going to return to the Balearic Islands. At any rate, he had to hug the coast, and this was a typical thing for ancient admirals to do because many of their ships were not great at navigation. We also don't know what kinds of crews Gnaeus was able to put on board the 20 ships he took. so we don't know if he had professional navigators or anything like that. And further, they had not been able to stock up on provisions, so they needed to stay close to the coast, and then later, when the opportunity presented itself, they could go in and get water, food, and all the things that they would actually need to make any kind of a sea journey. So perhaps Gaius Didius, the admiral at Gades, was able to guess correctly that this is exactly what Pompey would do, that he would leave Cartia, hug the coast, and it would take him a while to be in a position to try to make for the open water. And so Gaius Didius was actually able to catch Pompey within 4 days. And this is exactly when Gnaeus had decided to stop to take on provisions. So when the naval battle happened, Didius had the advantage of already being at sea, whereas Gnaeus had disembarked many of his men. So Didius won very speedily. It's also worth mentioning again, we don't know if Gnaeus even had full crews, most likely not. And so this battle was a foregone conclusion once it started. Also, we have to keep in mind Gnaeus' ships were probably not making very good progress, and again for the same reason of almost certainly being undermanned. Gnaeus' men retreated from their ships, they made it inland, and they started building their defense around a local tower. And what was great about this tower is that it commanded a pass of some sort. And this meant that they were fighting on a narrow front, which would prevent the overwhelming numbers of Didius' force from just completely winning immediately. Now, technically, at least on Wikipedia, this engagement has been given an official battle designation, but I think that is to overrate the importance and size of this engagement. This would have involved maybe a few hundred men on Gnaeus' side, maybe a couple thousand on Didius's, and I think that this so-called battle is probably really closer to being more like the shootout at the OK Corral than it is being like the Battle of Munda, where Gnaeus just lost. Anyway, I would disagree with the battle designation for this, but there is a battle designation if you're interested. As for Gnaeus' part in this, he almost certainly had nothing to do with any of it, because he was too wounded to fight at all in the front ranks, and apparently he spent most of this battle in hiding. So, in addition to his ongoing shoulder and leg issues, he also fell and twisted his ankle really badly, perhaps even spraining it, and so apparently he had to be carried everywhere he had gone, and people had hidden him in a hole in a ravine, or a kind of cave of some kind. And so he was in hiding for most of the fighting. Eventually, the Caesarians break through, they massacre most of his men, and then one of those men decides to save himself by pointing out where Pompey's hiding. So Gnaeus was now dragged out of his hiding hole, he got decapitated, and then his head was sent to show to local leaders around Spain. And the writer of the Spanish War account makes it seem as if Caesar himself never actually viewed the head, because Caesar was in a different city than where the head arrived. But at any rate, though, Gnaeus Pompeius was dead, and in the opinion of most, this is where Caesar's civil war officially ended. And so, by April or so of 45, the dream was dead, the dream that his father had started. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus the Younger was without a doubt one of the more significant commanders of Caesar's civil war. At the war's outset, one would have felt ridiculous claiming that in a war destined to last for only 4 years, that Pompey's eldest son, who was still too young to have held an office, would go on to be one of the small handful of people who would hold supreme command in that conflict. There would be no reason to think that he would hold such an office, even if something were to happen to his dad. And yet, Gnaeus was to prove that he had a lot of his father's talents. The elder Pompey largely distinguished himself not from tactical genius, but rather organizational skills, and it looks like Gnaeus inherited a lot of that. Just as his father was able to clear the Mediterranean of pirates due to his organizational abilities, so too Gnaeus was able to put together an army of 13 legions, including forming a lot of them from scraps. And so, this was impressive. Gnaeus also showed a lot of military potential, although he never had the time or opportunity to really develop those skills and become a large-scale thinker the way that his father was. And certainly once he is tested as supreme commander against Caesar, he's found distinctly lacking. And a lot of that is simply because the man does not have enough seasoning to compete with someone like Caesar. Perhaps if he had had more experience, he could have made more of a go of it. But as things stand, despite his inexperience, he was still able to give Caesar, in Caesar's own words, the fight of his life. So Gnaeus does have a lot of ability, yet he also has a lot of problems that would have prevented him from really succeeding in the long run. Temperamentally, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus the Younger was not meant for political leadership. He had apparently no sense of humor, he was very thin-skinned, and he had an authoritarian personality. Given that people in the late Republic were worried about the rise of someone who had those traits, Gnaeus would have almost certainly been murdered if he had lived longer. Let's say even if he had prevailed over Caesar, almost certainly the same assassins who killed Caesar would have killed the younger Gnaeus Pompeius instead. Because again, he seemed exactly like the kind of guy who would flout the Republic and rule in his own interest, especially if he felt like somebody had made a negative comment about his nose, or thought that his toga wasn't the best toga. And so, Gnaeus did have some flaws built in that would have really limited his success and prevented him from being anything like an Augustus. Unless, of course, he was able to really curb those excesses and mature significantly. And it's not entirely clear that he was on any kind of path to do something like that. It's also worth mentioning that early in the war, he almost certainly was the best legate. Now, of course, we could also make an argument for Aetius Varus, who technically won in Africa, and then built the province up and built an army that would be the second front for the Pompeians. But Gnaeus had a lot more success on a tactical level, and with a smaller force, it's worth noting. The Spanish campaign, of course, Gnaeus did an excellent job assembling a coalition, but again, he made some mistakes. He was outmaneuvered by Caesar. He let Caesar take the initiative, and ultimately he failed at Ategua, and that started to really undermine people's confidence in him. Because his brother would go on to have a much longer rebellion, it's easy to sort of think of his brother as being more capable and important. That being said, while we can argue about the various abilities of each brother, I think it's certainly safe to say that Gnaeus, just due to his positioning and due to the size and scope of his command, actually was the more significant of the two brothers. And in fact, almost every scholar of Caesar's civil war would agree that it's Gnaeus' death that marks the end of Caesar's civil war. It would take his brother a few years to really reemerge as a factor. So Gnaeus' death is far more significant even than his brother's later during the Second Triumvirate. Another little piece of Gnaeus' significance is that, like his father, he also arguably set an imperial precedent. So, famously, his dad had the Gabinian law passed in order to fight pirates, and this gave him proconsular authority all across the Mediterranean within 20 miles of the coast. So this is something similar to the commander-in-chief status that the emperors would enjoy later. One precedent that Gnaeus helped to establish, whether he intended to or not, is that he was declared Imperator, or general, by his men. Not by the Senate, not by any former magistrate handing these men off to him as a legate, but simply by the men themselves. And the only possible precedent before that for such a thing is when Pompey did something similar with his own father's veterans during Sulla's invasion against the Marians. So we could attribute that to Pompey Sr., but I think actually that Pompey Jr. deserves the nod here for setting that particular precedent, because he was getting this command offered to him by men who were mutinying. And if you know anything about the history of the Roman Empire, many of the new emperors who would emerge to challenge were men who were declared emperor by legions that were mutinying. And so, in many ways, Pompey Jr. was a man decades and decades ahead of his time. He would have fit in perfectly well in 69 CE. Another little thing that Gnaeus provided, and this time it was entirely beyond his control, is that after the Battle of Munda concluded and Caesar went back to Italy, he celebrated a lavish triumph over the Pompeians. He was elated to have won against them, and for the assassins this was the final straw, because Caesar was very much celebrating the death and defeat of his enemies, Roman enemies, not foreign. And so Gnaeus, by really making Caesar fight such a desperate battle, perhaps had broken down the last of Caesar's reserve. And Caesar felt truly alive, having survived something as horrible as the Munda campaign. And so perhaps that led him to celebrate harder than he otherwise would have in order to make a point. And this is what pushed men like Cassius over the edge and led them to famously assassinate Caesar on the Ides of March. Anyhow, it is worth noting that Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus the Younger was a man of great significance, even if he often does get overlooked in favor of his father and even his younger brother. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.